think we've had four presentations, very rich, and then we have already many questions. I will try to formulate for you. For now, the questions are more for Mireille Paquet and Bénédicte Michalon, but I think the other will come, other interlocutors will come later. Then some questions to Mireille. A question from Marie Moncada. I have the feeling that the scientific literature working on sanctuary cities highly focuses on crime and not on access to health policies or housing policies, for instance, putting aside the will to not check immigration status. Would you agree with this? Another question from two other questions which has to see with a comparison with the United States. Caroline Kaplan asked, what are the results of such policies in the US? Well, you will not give us another keynote, but just resuming. And question of Catherine Lejeune, do sanctuary cities in Canada include such initiative as DADTs or provide IDs for the undocumented as in the US? We have some questions, a group of questions for Bénédicte. Imran Saïr Hassan, can you please specify how integration policies may work in these applied policies for asylum seekers? Another from Marie Moncada, thank you very much for these new results. Have you noticed other negative consequences of moving asylum seekers to small cities? I was thinking about two hypotheses: the difficulty to access health services, the déserts médicaux, on the one hand, and the refusal of the local population, which maybe is more linked to the far-right vote on the other hand. And question from Rafik Arfawi for both Mireille and Bénédicte. Can we consider the involvement of local people for the reception of rejected asylum seekers in small and medium-sized towns and rural areas in France as close to the model of sanctuary cities in Canada? Yeah, of course, this has the two side of the problematic, but the distance between one another case, sanctuary cities in Canada and the small rural integrations in France. And another question for Bénédicte from Chantal Crène. Can't we say that in the small city of Nontron, where you made your fieldworks, there are the two positions of hospitality and inhospitality? In Sainte-Foy-la-Grande, nowadays included in urban politics, a few kilometers from where you investigate, we are currently carrying out research on food and immigration, and we see that it is a mixed place. Solidarity and racism coexist in the same time because of different socials. And one question from Alia Fakri to Mireille Paquet. Thank you for your input. Do the so-called sanctuary or localist access policies you mentioned also include at times advocacy or lobbying efforts to expand the mandate resources of cities to enable them to work more closely with undocumented communities? And a question to Bénédicte Michalon. To what extent are municipalities involved in the process of welcoming asylum seekers on their territories? Perhaps we have this first round of questions for Mireille and Bénédicte, and then after I come back with other questions, perhaps for Thomas and Cyrille. And if we could have a small time in the final to have a discussion between you four, it would be very great. And then you can prepare some questions from one to another yet. Then Mireille?
Merci. These are great questions, so I'll try not to speak for too long. And if I forget to answer one of the questions, don't hesitate to write it back in the questions and I'll address it. So I guess one of the last questions was about whether what I presented on and what Bénédicte was talking about were kind of the same, on the same spectrum, or were somehow the same side of the two sides of a coin. So I think that one of the important things, and I guess like that's part of the motivation behind this project, is that there's a lot of confusion about, you know, acts of sanctuary and local policies where people are involved at providing support for people versus actual municipal policies. And what we were trying to do is really focus on action publique, or public action, as a way to really look at the political involvement towards this. But that doesn't mean that in the cities I talked about, there aren't major mobilization by social movement and associative actors that that provide support for people without status and undocumented population. And actually, so from that standpoint, while the policies I discuss are quite different in what Bénédicte was talking about, I think that in both cases, local actors are key players in the context we're looking at. One of the things that we have been increasingly more interested in as part of this project is to actually address the disconnect between, or the tension between, those actors and the city actors, the mayor, the city offices, and all of that, because there is surprisingly some resistance, or not surprisingly, depending on how you see it, between the people that have been providing support for undocumented population in these cities and the municipal actors that are trying to get involved in that field as well, right? And so I hope that answers your first question. Related to the literature on sanctuary cities, I think that it's fair to say that there has been a lot of focus on crime and on the impact of sanctuary cities in terms of security. And I think that was driven largely by the political context, especially in the United States, where some of you might remember not so long ago, the president of the United States was using sanctuary city as a lightning rod, right? As something that was, that was actually a point of contention. Actually, he was proposing, or he was threatening to cut funding to cities and to states that had sanctuary policies. And the idea behind that discourse was that these policies basically equal to anarchy, right? So the idea he was saying, and a lot of actors in the US that are against these policies put forward, is that, you know, anybody can do anything. There's no more police, there's no more control. And so a lot of the literature has been actually involved in disbanding that idea, and actually showing that it's the opposite, that people do tend to report more crimes when they're not afraid of being deported, do tend to actually provide evidence and things like that. But I would argue that this is really insufficient in terms of evaluation, right? Because it really doesn't go to a lot of the other impact that these policies can have. And there's been new research on that, but I think we can do a lot more. So thank you for that question. And if you're interested in that, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. We could talk about the challenges, though, of measuring different consequences, because we've tried with that survey and it's really complicated, right, to measure the impact. And going on, the question about whether Canadian cities provide IDs, and also whether Canadian cities have engaged in some kind of activism or advocacy towards the national government. So right now, the City of Montreal is running an experiment to provide identification certificate. So it's not a piece of ID. So several US cities have actual local identification cards that people can use to rent an apartment, get a driver's license, and access other services. We don't have that in Canada, in large part because we actually don't have a national ID. So that's a whole other story. But the City of Montreal has created, with an associative actor, a community actor, a service that allows people without status to go to that nonprofit to get their identity confirmed, and then they have this certificate that they can use to access some services. However, that certificate is not accepted by other levels of government and is not entirely accepted by all actors. So we still haven't seen any evaluation of the results, but so there's experimentation, obviously, but we're far from that. And when it comes to advocacy, I'd say that obviously those cities are in Canada quite involved in advocacy, but it is super informal. And part of it has to do with Canadian cities actually being really crushed for money and being really, really limited in their in their clout in our federal system. So while they're trying to advocate, you could also argue that the rise of sanctuary cities is one way of advocating by the sides, right? And by showing kind of, what they owe to do, by showing how they're different from the national government, as opposed to going frontally and demand things to the national government. So I hope that answers some of the questions, and happy to answer more.
Okay, thank you very much, Mireille. Bénédicte,
thank you. Thank you for the questions, and as for Mireille, if I forget something, please do not hesitate to be back. I will try to make a whole answer and to address everything in one answer. First, I just one thing I would like to precise is I do not try to think if it is positive or negative to send asylum seekers in the countryside. It's not my point to see if it's good or not. What I try to understand is how it happens there, and if the territory has an impact. Maybe not, and it could be not, but I think it does, and this is what I try to understand. The second thing I would like to say is that the fieldwork I related to today is not the one which is mentioned in one question. It's not the fieldwork I did in Dordogne, it's in another department. And so the department I talked about today is a department which is very poor, has a shrinking population for quite a lot of decades, and is quite oriented on the left. So there were no reactions to any opening of centers. There was never any mobilization against the opening of centers in this department. And this brings me to speak about the role of the municipalities, because there were several questions about that. It is not a matter of fact that I didn't choose to speak about that. It is also a result of my fieldwork, because I tried to understand how locals involved in this issue. And what I could understand is that, except in one case, municipalities don't involve in the issue. The only case where the municipality is involved is in the village, because it is very important for the village to have this center, partly because the school depends on the center. It's a very small village with a very small school, and if the center closes, there will be a danger for closing the one class. So this is the only case where the municipality is involved, but it is involved in very unofficial ways. So there are a few official helps to the center, like having settled a shuttle for the asylum seekers to go shopping in the next city every day. But it's almost the only thing. all the other helps are informal. And for example, it happened several times that the mayor found some housing for rejected asylum seekers' family. But it's informal. So everyone knows it, but it's not claimed as such. It's not claimed as a policy of the village. It's just a mayor who, as a person, helps. And in the other cities, which are little cities and middle-sized cities, I asked to all the social workers, what are your connections to the municipality? And it was always, well, in fact, we don't have connections. So the municipalities are not really involved in the issue, which is, in fact, is not surprising, because who is leading this dispersal policy? It is the French state, and the authority to which the service providers relate are the departmental representation of the French state. They relate to the prefecture, not to the municipalities. So maybe it's a department where the situation is particular, but I'm not sure. And I would say it's not really an issue on the local level for the municipalities. They are not really involved. Some of the social workers told me, well, they just don't care. As long as there is no problem, they just don't care. So I would say to the question if we can see there a kind of sanctuary policy, I would say no, because in fact, in this department, local authorities are not really involved in the issue. The other thing I could precise is that the department is also known, the prefecture is known for its quite a smooth migration policy. It is known that it's a prefecture which is not very hard against migrants, undocumented migrants. So it's a situation where people who do not get protection can remain without having big fear of being arrested and put in detention. It does happen. And the prefecture also use house arrest, but it's not massive. And there are people who remain there without document for years and who have no problems. And of course, the volunteers and the charitable networks, they know that. So there is also a kind of play with the prefecture, which is, okay, we know there are some undocumented migrants there and there, but as long as there is no problem, okay, it's like we don't do anything. And so what I could ask also is about the integration policies. In fact, they are part of the persuasion work that social workers lead. Because when they say we have means to help you, it also includes the integration policies, of course, because there are not a lot of migrants in the department. Until recently, you could get social housing quite easily because population was leaving the department, and there are different institutions that are present to help the migrant who will stay. But on the other hand, they also confront the dismantling of common public institutions in the French countryside. And this makes some issues very difficult. And the most difficult one is a medical issue, because there is only one hospital in the department, which is far away from everything. And there is a big lack of medics. And in every city, social workers really fight to have medics to follow asylum seekers. So we see how the issue of migrants just meets more general issue of life in rural countryside. I mean, what I think also is important, what is important is also not to specialize too much the way we consider exiles and asylum seekers reception policies. We also meet their problems which are just common problems for the population who lives there. And I think, I don't know, I think I answered everything. Okay.
Thank you, Bénédicte.
Thank you.
I think there are many other questions. Let's try to continue. There is a question to Thomas about the bibliography of his work. I think it would be a good thing if you could send to everybody, to the public, the address of the website of the Localacc project. And there is a first question to Cyrille after another one that François will put. A question by Ayat Lacroix. Cyrille, are migrants involved at all in designing welcoming cities? How do you involve the proper people of migrants in the designing of the welcoming city? And another question to Cyrille by François. We will put it himself. François.
Well, obviously, it depends of the program, but obviously people are welcome to be involved in the program, and mostly I would say they are welcome to be physically involved. I mean, like that's why I showed that picture. The camp in Grande Sainte had two lives. The first part of his life was when it was dealt by Utopia 56, an association that was very young at the time, NGO that was very young, and the people of that organization were people coming from the organization of festival, of music festival, and they are very used to have people being involved and co-designing the places and working with them. And actually, it's the time when the camp kind of worked well, as we can say. In the second time, the French state decided to take care of the camp, to become the to run it. They say, okay, now we're gonna run it like an official places, and they designed an organization that was used to run retired people's house, and suddenly they began to run the camp as a retired hospital place, and people were not involved. Migrants were not involved anymore in the design and the running of the camp, and it brought a lot of problem to it, and the camp became much more dirty, and they cut down all the extensions that people had built to the camp. So obviously, in the scheme that we showed, in the schemes that we co-designed and co-thought in the Welcoming City book, obviously people are involved. People are involved in the design, people are involved in construction, people are involved in policy and everyday policy. Obviously, it is the way we want it. And I don't know if I was clear about that. No, obviously I was not clear, but the agenda under the Welcoming City is an agenda for all cities. And okay. Obviously those policy where people are involved are policy for everybody.
Okay. Thank you, Cyrille. François has another question for you. François? Micro. On
t'entend pas, François.
On t'entend pas.
Thank you, Cyrille, for your wonderful presentation. At the end, you had a comparative dimension. You alluded to other situations across the world, and especially favelas or slums in other continents. like Michel, I lived sometimes in Latin America. I have some experience of the barriadas around Lima and around La Paz, Bolivia. And I was struck by the fact that some of these barriadas were consolidating years after years. Material was changing. People were, for example, using adobe in the first place, and then provisional material, and then bricks, and then etc. And but because they have, or some of them at least, majority of them, because they had no other solutions, wanted to settle on a permanent basis. While in the case of Calais or Grande Sainte, I imagine that the people have no intention to settle on a permanent basis. They want to leave the place as soon as possible because their desire is to get to England. So does it make a change in the way they conceive of the materials, the building of the camp, and how do you take into account this difference?
Thank you. Cyrille?
Well, basically, thank you, François. The thing is that, how to say that? There was a famous urban planner, Italian urban planner called Aldo Rossi, who in the 70s says that what makes a city is its permanency. People pass by, people live and die and birth in cities, and cities remain. So, of course, people go quickly or fast through cities, but the cities remain. For example, of Calais, obviously, people were kind of going through faster. But there were a lot of people in Calais that did not intend to go to England. There were, I remember, a lot of Sudanese people who were just there because it was the least bad place to be in France. I mean, people waiting for 18 months for an appointment at the prefecture for the paper. The best place to be in France was in Calais. Of course, people pass by Calais. But the thing is that since the demolition of the jungle, the situation is much worse. People just are chased every day. They can build a tent for 1 or 2 days before being chased away. And I mean, obviously, in Calais, at least, there was no better solution since the jungle. So, of course, it was a fabrication that was very special. Of course, people in general did not intend to stay in Calais, but the place stayed. And Calais is still there. And we can regret that the jungle of, I mean, maybe there could be better thing in Calais, but since the jungle of Calais, there was no better installation or construction there. So, yeah, obviously, for the comparison with other places, how to say? I mean, it's very strange because people, when they arrive in a slum, very often they don't want to be there for the rest of their life. Obviously, we can think that their dream. I can speak about Mayotte, which is a place with permanent slums. If you have a dream, you dream to go out of that place, and you dream to go to a better place. Nobody wants really to stay in the slums. As soon as you get richer, you're going to build something else. So obviously, your question is very right, because it's more obvious in Calais that people didn't want to stay. But at the end of the day, everybody makes his life as a moving in a way. I guess we are all migrants.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyrille. Thank you, François, for your question. I have a general first question for Thomas, and then a general observation by one of our of the public. Thomas, I was wondering if in your analysis of various kind of networks, global, international networks, you include that this element of Mireille analysis, that is what is the efficiency actually, what do these cities do make actually for the welcoming of migrants, or is it based basically on the public declaration or the politic positioning, or I think, of course, of Paris, the city of Paris is member of the Envita, and nevertheless, there are many questions about in which way Paris can pretend to be a ville refuge, that it is claiming to be a ville refuge, and we see that it is a very polemical question. I think I was very interested by Mireille's demonstration that something like 30 to 40% of people are thinking that actually the life is better for migrants in cities who are claiming they are welcoming cities than in others. How can you measure at this global level the actual real involvement of all these networks, including the local in the transnational level? This is one question. Just a moment. There is also a general question by Rafael Bazurli. Thanks very much for this important, interesting event. A comment for all the speakers. One of the key elements emerging from the presentations is the absence of a univocal definition of sanctuary. That's a bit part of my question, of sanctuary city across space and time. I think one necessary feature to define them as such is the possibility for local actors to obstruct the local enforcement of national laws. What is the relation between the city, la ville et l'État, the city and the state, especially when it comes to immigrant detention and deportation? US cities have significant prerogatives in this field, but my impression is that this is much less the case in other countries, notably non-federal states. What is your thinking about this? Come back to my question at the beginning. How is the conflict or relation, political and technical, also a question between in the relation between the city and the state? Thomas first, and perhaps everybody after.
Thank you for all these questions. So the first one, the gap between what they say they do and what they actually do, and how can we measure the efficiency of these networks at the local level? So as mentioned at the beginning of my talk, what they do is actually part of this other axis of research we are developing with Localacc, and Bénédicte has just presented one of these aspects. So what is carried out on the field is part of the case studies we are carrying out. And indeed, there can be a gap. For example, also, for example, the city of Lyon. Lyon, he is part of many city networks, but actually since what is his name? Sorry, I forgot his name. The former mayor, who was also the Home Ministry of France. So since he became a Home Ministry of France, immigration and the welcoming and integration of immigrants, well, he went out of the radar of the municipality, and so he became much less involved in these networks. Even if on the paper he was still there, he was still part of Eurocities, but the city of Lyon became less and less involved in these cities.
The former Gérard Collomb, yeah.
Collomb, exactly. And so, yeah, there can be a gap in that sense. But still, well, my objective there was first to give an account of an overview, a global overview of what's going on in this field of city networking. And also, the other objective of the research is to account on what circulates within these networks and what circulates between the networks, and how this vocabulary about, and I'm coming to the second question, this vocabulary around sanctuarity, around the firewall policies, and this whole vocabulary is circulating from the US to Europe, to the US back again, and then so on and so forth. And so this kind of things we are interested in. And about this issue of sanctuarity, there is a huge difference between the US, the North America, and the European context. I mean, the background context of was the first sanctuary organizations are actually church organizations. So it's really part and parcel of the religious vocabulary in the first place, which then incorporated the municipal policy. But in Europe, you have a huge variety of philosophical or ideological background. It doesn't come only from church organizations. For example, the Global Parliament of Mayors is pretty much driven by the ideas of Barber, and Barber is much more liberal, coming from a more liberal background. And so for him, the cities are much better adapted and better equipped to tackle the global issues raised by the neoliberal globalization, a bit against the state as well, but in a neoliberal way. So there are a variety of ideological backgrounds at play here.
Thank you. Mireille?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for this question. So I'm just going to follow up on what Thomas said, because I think he's raised really important point in relation to that question. I think that to go back to Rafaela's question, which is a really good one, right? Pointing to the fact that there is no universal definition. And to me, that's the signal that political actors and Action Publique is actually working towards something, but that there is, and that's this label that we need to actually problematize and to try to understand. So why, and that was our desire, right? Why do cities decide to use these words and these labels? And part of it might just be, as Thomas was saying, not just be, but part of it might be about the circulation and the diffusion of teams. But the decision to adopt such policies and to adopt such labels, as Rafaela was saying once again, occurs in different institutional contexts. And he's right to point that in the US, the cities do have some capacities to resist quite potently enforcement, which is not the case in other federal states. So Canadian cities cannot resist enforcement the same way, or in non-federal states. But that doesn't mean that actors don't engage in some continuum of this, don't engage with some continuum of this label, and don't engage with some of those practices. And so part of what we're thinking with our team is actually to maybe move away from this kind of stringent definition of sanctuary that Rafaela pointed to, which is the one that I think is accepted in literature, but to think more about it as true, more of a process-based understanding of it. And doing that kind of allow us to capture more types of local state resistance. So part of this is that, a part of this could be answered that way. But I think ultimately the question for us, at least as political scientists, is really to ask, like, why would a mayor decide to do that? Why would a city council decide to do that? And to really try to question the kind of the idea that it's only for inclusionary reasons, right? And I think that we can learn a lot by thinking about how, well, we know our motivations of local actors and tons of other policy areas that have nothing to do with immigration might actually be at play in the immigration sector as well. It might be easier to do that from the standpoint of North America, because our political actors don't necessarily see the word immigrant as highly negative. The politics surrounding immigration is different. But I don't think that that means that this is not occurring also in European countries or in other regions of the world. So that's at least what I hope we can try to do, right? And I think that the work that everyone presented kind of pointed to that in a way, and especially the work on network, which really points to how people talk and try strategically to engage with these ideas.
Thank you. I was wondering if there is not also that the question would be moved to Bénédicte, for example. The question would be the link between the major or the municipality with the civil society, with the social movement, with the association. And what we have seen in France, in some small towns, is that smaller is the town, and nearer is the relation with the social movement, with the actors of civil society, and then the pressure on the elected council, the pressure on the major is more individualized, is more near, is more political, and then you can have at some local level of small towns more efficiency of the welcoming initiative at the city level. I don't know if Bénédicte, you have this on the rural and small cities observation.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I agree with what you said. And what could also be of interest is that if cities or municipalities have no power in regard to immigration legislation, they can be nevertheless some informal interplay with the prefecture.
Yeah, right.
And I think it's something that does happen on departments which are rural, because mayors are well known by the prefecture, and one of them that I interviewed told me that it did happen that he called the prefecture to ask to be more positive for a family, for an undocumented family. Mm-hmm. So of course he doesn't do it very often, but when it seems to be very necessary to him and justified, he does it. So it's not his official role. It's more, I think he acts more like a person, but it's also his position as mayor that makes him a more powerful person in the department. And everyone told me that it was something special to their eyes, that being in a rural department, all the informal relationships were much more efficient than in big cities. It is how people there consider they work. I mean, social workers and the few officials that I could interview. So everyone says, yeah, here it's easier. We can act, we can say, we can move on easier because it's a small place, small department. We know each other very well. But it was also another, the director of the center told me, yeah, there is also a counterpart, which is when the prefecture wants us to slowly be more coercive, we cannot resist. Yeah. Because we are so few, we cannot say no. Otherwise, next time we ask for something, they will say no. So it's close connection between the prefecture and the providers. It's like, okay, we give you that, be careful. So they are negotiating their positions.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank
you. So it's not formal because the providers, well, what I explained, they do have a very official role in the dispersal policy, but the municipalities seems not very involved or just unofficially. So I wouldn't talk about sanctuary policies in this case, not at all.
Yeah. Thank you, Bénédicte. Thomas or Cyrille, you want to add something? We have some very few minutes before closing. No, it's okay. Well, thank you very much to you four. Thank you to Mireille for your very rich keynote, and thank you, Bénédicte, Cyrille, Thomas. It was very rich. I think we have a very big, un grand chantier, as we say in French, a very big project about this. It would have been interesting to make a case study on Paris and the prefecture, but we keep it for another time. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. And I think now we have some time of a pause. And bye-bye.
Thank you a lot.
Good continuation for
Thank
this
you.
conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.